Their codes were broken. Our trap was set. I stood on the flight deck of the USS Enterprise that morning of June 4, 1942, watching our dive bombers warming up for launch, their engines roaring like angry lions preparing to strike. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly before us, painted gold by the rising sun, deceptively peaceful for what was about to become the graveyard of the Imperial Japanese Navy's proudest carriers. Somewhere out there, roughly 200 miles northwest of Midway Island, Admiral Nagumo's 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the very same ships that had devastated Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier, were steaming confidently toward their target. Their decks were loaded with aircraft, their crews preparing for what they believed would be another easy victory. What they didn't know was that we had been reading their messages for weeks, knew exactly where they would be, and were about to spring the most devastating ambush in naval history. My name was Norman Jack Dusty Clyse, Lieutenant Junior Grade, a dive bomber pilot with Scouting Squadron 6 aboard the Enterprise. Born in Coffeyville, Kansas in 1916, I had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1938. I earned my wings in April 1941 and had been flying combat missions since the Marshall Islands raids. By June 1942, I believed I understood carrier warfare, but nothing had prepared me for what we were about to witness. The complete destruction of Japan's carrier force in mere minutes would change the entire course of the Pacific War. The ready room aboard Enterprise was thick with cigarette smoke at 0400 hours on June 4th. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, Jr., our Air Group commander, stood at the front with his pointer. McCluskey was a 1926 Naval Academy graduate who had taken command of the Air Group just 2 months earlier. "Gentlemen," he began, "the Japanese carrier force has been located approximately 200 miles northwest of Midway." He tapped the map. 4 carriers. Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, accompanied by 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers. These weren't just any carriers. These were the heart of the Kido Butai, the mobile strike force. Akagi and Kaga were Pearl Harbor veterans, massive ships that could launch over 60 aircraft each. Soryu and Hiryu were newer, faster, equally deadly. Together they carried 248 aircraft and the most experienced carrier pilots in the world. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo had been reading the Japanese naval code JN-25 for weeks. McCluskey continued, "We know their entire operation plan. They'll strike Midway at dawn, then wait for our carriers to respond so they can ambush us. What they don't realize is that we're already here." The intelligence officer explained Operation MI, Admiral Yamamoto's plan to capture Midway and destroy our carrier force. It was elaborate, perhaps too elaborate. Invasion forces from the southwest, a diversionary attack in the Aleutians, the carrier strike force from the northwest, and Yamamoto himself commanding from the battleship Yamato 300 miles behind. "The Japanese will launch their Midway strike at 0430, he said. "Most of their fighters will be engaged. Their carriers will be recovering and rearming aircraft, their most vulnerable moment. This is when we strike." Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, commanding Scouting Squadron 6, made careful notes. A Pearl Harbor veteran, Gallagher was meticulous. Beside him, Lieutenant Richard Best from bombing. Squadron 6 studied the weather. Wind southeast at 5 knots, scattered clouds at 1,500 feet, perfect diving conditions. I looked around at my squadron mates. Some were combat veterans, others facing their first battle. We all understood the stakes. The Japanese had better fighters. The Zero could outmaneuver anything we had. They had more experienced pilots, and we would be operating at extreme fuel range, 175 miles out and back, with minimal reserve. "Torpedo 8 from Hornet will go in first," McCluskey added. "The dive bombers follow. We launch at 0700. By 0600, the Enterprise flight deck was controlled chaos. Deck crews in colored jerseys performed their specialized tasks. Red shirts loading bombs, purple shirts fueling aircraft, brown shirts checking mechanical systems. I walked toward my aircraft, SBD Bureau number 639. My rear gunner, John Snowden, was already checking his twin .30 caliber machine guns. Snowden was from Illinois, a quiet man who had saved my life before by spotting incoming zeros. "Morning, Snowden," I said, climbing up. "Morning, Mr. Clyde. Going to be hot today." I ran through my pre-flight inspection, control surfaces, bomb rack, fuel load. We had 230 gallons in the main tank, plus 258-gallon wing tanks. With careful management, that gave us about 4.5 hours of flight time. The SBD Dauntless wasn't the fastest, 255 miles per hour top speed, but it was incredibly stable in a dive and tough as nails. It could absorb punishment that would destroy other aircraft. I strapped into the cockpit surrounded by familiar instruments: altimeter, airspeed, fuel gauges, engine temperature, oil pressure. At 0645, pilot start engines came over the loudspeaker. I pressed the starter and the right R-1820 Cyclone roared to life. First to launch were the fighters, 24 F-4F Wildcats for combat air patrol. Next went the torpedo bombers, 14 TBD Devastators from Torpedo Squadron 6, under Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay. I watched them lumber down the deck with their Mark 13 torpedoes barely clearing the deck edge. They looked vulnerable. Finally, our turn. Scouting 6 under Gallagher with 18 planes, Bombing 6 under Best with 15 planes. I was number 2 in the 3rd Division. McCluskey would lead us all. The launch was always dangerous. Enterprise turned into wind, increased to 30 knots. The flight deck officer waved his flag, full power. The flag dropped. I released brakes and surged forward. The island flashed by, deck edge approached. At 65 knots, I eased back and felt the wheels leave the deck. For a moment, the heavily loaded bomber hung, then the wings bit air and we climbed. "Good takeoff, Mr. Clyde," Snowden said. "Thanks. Keep your eyes peeled." It took an hour for the strike force to form up. By 0806, we had 33 dive bombers from Enterprise climbing to 19,000 feet. The planned rendezvous with Hornet's group never happened. McCluskey decided to proceed alone rather than waste fuel. We flew northwest at 19,000 feet in radio silence. I constantly checked instruments and bomb sight. At this altitude, I would have perhaps 10 seconds to line up and release. No second chance. At 0920, we reached the intercept point. Nothing. Empty ocean. My fuel gauge showed over half consumed. Quick calculation, maybe 30 minutes to find them before turning back or ditching. Radio silence was oppressive, everyone doing the same calculations. Then at 0955, McCluskey waggled his wings. Looking down, I saw a white wake, a lone destroyer racing northeast. McCluskey turned to follow, betting it was heading toward the main fleet. For 20 agonizing minutes, we followed that wake, fuel dropping toward empty. Then at 10:20, we saw them. The Japanese fleet appeared below like toys on a blue carpet. 4 carriers in 2 groups surrounded by escorts, aircraft on decks, white wakes showing maneuvering. Incredibly, no Zero fighters at our altitude. All were down low, finishing off the torpedo squadrons. "This is McCluskey," the radio crackled. "Scouting 6, take the left carrier, Bombing 6, the right." But in confusion, both squadrons began diving on Kaga. I pushed forward and nosed into my dive. Acceleration was brutal, pressing me back. The altimeter unwound. 18, 15, 12,000 feet. The carrier grew in my bomb sight. I could see aircraft on deck, crew running, anti-aircraft guns swiveling. Black flak puffs burst around us, but I held steady. At 10,000 feet, I saw individual planes on Kaga's deck being refueled and rearmed. Hoses snaking, bombs on carts. Perfect timing, their most vulnerable moment. Gallagher released first. His bomb struck near Kaga's island. Fire erupted, bodies blown into the air. At 2,500 feet, I pressed release and pulled back hard. 9 Gs crushed me into my seat, vision tunneling. The Dauntless groaned, wings flexing, then leveling out just above water, racing away. "Direct hit, forward elevator," Snowden shouted. Banking left, I saw my bomb had struck perfectly. Kaga's forward deck erupted in flames. Gallagher hit after another striking home. Within seconds, 4 direct hits and Kaga was engulfed stem to stern. Simultaneously, Dick Best pulled out early, realizing the error. He and 2 wingmen headed for Akagi. Best put his 1,000-pound bomb through Akagi's deck amidships. It penetrated to the hangar and exploded among armed aircraft. Akagi became an inferno. At exactly 10:22, Yorktown's dive bombers arrived and attacked Soryu. 3 1,000-pound bombs within 30 seconds. The carrier exploded, a fire pillar reaching 1,000 feet. 3 carriers mortally wounded in minutes. Pulling away, the scene below was hellish. Kaga was a floating volcano, explosions rippling through her. Her forward elevator, tons of steel, was blown completely off, spinning through air before crashing into ocean hundreds of yards away. Akagi burned bow to stern, deck buckling from heat. Tiny figures, crew, jumped into burning oil-covered water. Soryu listed heavily, hull ripped by explosions. She rolled over, hull glistening, before slipping beneath the waves. 20 minutes from operational to submarine tomb. Over 700 men went down with her, but we missed Hiryu, operating 10 miles north, hidden by rain squalls. She was launching counterstrikes against our carriers. Zeros, 3 o'clock high. Snowden's guns chattered as 2 fighters dove on us. I pushed forward, using our superior diving speed. Tracers whipped past. Snowden's guns went silent. Snowden, you okay? Hit? But okay, got one. A Zero trailed smoke, spinning oceanward. But more were coming. I stayed low, jinking constantly, fuel gauge bouncing empty. The flight back was a nightmare, fuel gauge showing empty, but usually a few gallons remained. Unusable fuel, accessible if flying carefully. I leaned the mixture until the engine ran rough, risking fouled plugs for more minutes. Around me, Dauntlesses struggled, some trailing smoke, others running dry. Radio channels filled with desperate calls, engine cutting out, going in. Ditching, mark position. Enterprise, multiple aircraft emergency fuel. 2 Dauntlesses ahead, noses toward water. One pilot managed a controlled ditching, he and his gunner climbing onto the wing before sinking. My engine sputtered. Reserve tank, last gallons, minutes at most. Then Enterprise appeared on the horizon, deck turned for recovery. Emergency fuel, request immediate landing. You're number 3. Number 3. Watching 2 ahead land, precious seconds each. Engine missing badly. I was already descending toward the deck when the engine finally died on me. That's when reality hit hard. This was it. My one shot. I had just enough altitude and speed to make this work, nothing more. The landing signal officer was already waving me down, but I could see the problem immediately. I was coming in too high. There was only one thing to do. I pushed the nose down hard, sacrificing height to pick up speed. The propeller was just windmilling now, dead weight as I aimed for the 3rd wire. The flight deck seemed to rush up at me all at once. My wheels touched down and bounced hard. For a split second I thought I was going to miss everything, but then the tail hook caught and grabbed that wire. The sudden jolt slammed me back in my seat like a hammer blow. The deck crew was already sprinting before the propeller even stopped turning, pulling me out of the cockpit and getting me clear. I was hit, but alive. They pulled me out and I could see the blood on my flight suit. Shoulder and leg, both took rounds, but I was conscious enough to know I'd make it. The important thing was I'd gotten the bird down. The damage to my plane told the whole story. Over 40 hits. Flak holes everywhere, pieces torn away, fabric hanging. How she held together at all, I honestly couldn't tell you. The whole aircraft should have come apart in the air, but it didn't. When I walked into the ready room afterward, the mood was heavy despite what we'd accomplished. Nobody was celebrating. We'd sent 14 torpedo bombers from Torpedo Squadron 6 that morning. Only 4 came back, 14 crews. 10 of them weren't coming home. But then we heard what happened to Hornet's group. The news was even worse. Torpedo Squadron 8 got completely wiped out. 15 aircraft went down that day, and 29 of the 30 men never came back. Just one survivor, George Gay. He was floating out there in the water, watching us dive while his whole squadron was being slaughtered around him. The TBD devastators those boys were flying were basically flying coffins against the Zeros. Obsolete death traps. They knew it. They went anyway. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron had led them straight in with no hesitation. His last words over the radio stuck with everybody. "We will go in. We won't turn back. Good luck." Not a single torpedo hit the carriers, but what they did accomplish was pull the Japanese fighters down low to deal with them. That sacrifice left the enemy's deck completely exposed for what came next. McCluskey came into the ready room with his shoulder wrapped up. A 20mm shell had caught him, but he was still grinning. We'd done damage, serious damage. 3 carriers, the Kaga, the Akagi, the Soryu. Gone. But Hiryu was still operational out there, and we'd gotten word she'd already hit the Yorktown. 3 bombs at noon had torn into her, and then 2 torpedoes at 2:30 in the afternoon. She was listing badly. They abandoned her. But the time that sacrifice bought us is what mattered. It gave us the chance to find Hiryu and finish her. The numbers we were hearing about the Japanese casualties just kept climbing. Around 2,500 so far, they figured. Each of those carriers carried between 12 and 1,500 crew members, plus all the aviators. Very few of them got rescued. When you thought about it, really thought about it, each one of those numbers represented someone's son, someone's husband, someone's father. All of them dead thousands of miles from anything they knew, dying for an empire's ambition. That afternoon we went back up again. 24 dive bombers went out and found Hiryu just after 5 in the evening. We put 4 bombs directly into her. She burned all through the night and eventually she went under. The Kido Butai, Japan's carrier striking force, the force that had terrified the Pacific for 6 months, simply ceased to exist. We spent the next few days chasing what was left of the Japanese fleet as they retreated. We sank the cruiser Kumano, but what really became clear as the days went on was the strategic earthquake we'd just caused. Japan had started this war with 6 fleet carriers, the most powerful naval force the world had ever seen. Now they had 2. They could build replacements, sure, but building a ship takes time. What they couldn't replace was already dead in the water. Over 3,000 trained sailors and naval aviators were gone. More than 100 veteran pilots, men who'd been flying since China in 1937. Men who understood carrier operations at a level that couldn't be taught in a classroom. That knowledge died with them. The Japanese Navy spent the rest of the war trying to rebuild, but they never recovered. They started with superiority and ended with inferiority they couldn't overcome. Intelligence made the difference for us. The codebreakers had given us the Japanese plans. That allowed us to position our carriers exactly where we needed them, instead of just reacting and arriving too late. Without those decoded messages, we would have been fighting on their terms, not ours. The battle also exposed weaknesses in their planning. Yamamoto's strategy spread forces across thousands of miles, too scattered to support each other. Radio silence meant that when things went wrong, nobody could coordinate a response. They underestimated what we could do, expecting us to react in predictable ways. Admiral Nagumo made the decision that changed everything. When scouts reported American ships at 7:28 in the morning, he was in the middle of rearming his planes for a second strike on Midway. Launch immediately and go after us with partially armed aircraft, or wait and arm everything properly. Those 30 minutes of hesitation were fatal. By the time he launched, we were already diving. That night, standing on the deck of the Enterprise steaming southwest, I looked up at the same stars that had been over Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. That morning in December, I'd watched 4 carriers die. Now 4 more were gone, different flags but the same terrible finality. The adrenaline was all burned out by then. All that was left was exhaustion and a kind of emptiness. I kept thinking about those torpedo crews. Waldron's men knew their planes were death traps. The Zero would tear them apart, and it did. They held their course anyway while the fighters ripped through them. One by one, they died. Waldron's plane exploded right in front of them, cartwheeling into the ocean in flames. George Gay watched it happen. He floated in the water for 30 hours, hiding under a seat cushion when Japanese ships passed nearby, watching for sharks, waiting for rescue. A PBY finally picked him up, but 30 hours is a long time to carry that kind of memory. Survivor's guilt doesn't fade. I thought about the Japanese sailors too. When you're diving on a carrier, you see the men on deck. They're running to their stations, manning the guns, pushing burning aircraft over the side. They're not faceless enemies. They're young men just like us, fighting for their country. Some of them had been flying since the Chinese campaigns in 1937. They had families somewhere. They had dreams. All of it ended in fire that morning. The ocean filled with bodies. Some destroyers pulled men from the water, but thousands drowned or burned in the oil slick or were taken by sharks. War isn't clean or simple or glorious. It's young men dying far from home. The historians call Midway the turning point in the Pacific War. In one day, the balance of naval power shifted completely. Japan went from superiority to parity. Then, as American shipyards ramped up production, to increasing inferiority that kept getting worse. But the real victory wasn't just about ships. It was about combat power, equipment, training, experience, morale. All of it combined made the difference. Japan lost a generation of experienced pilots at Midway and later at Guadalcanal. Those men couldn't be replaced. Japan's pilot training programs might produce 100 trained carrier pilots in a year. America's programs were soon turning out thousands. The numbers just didn't work in Japan's favor anymore. Admiral Nimitz later said the battle came down to three things: intelligence officers breaking the Japanese codes, damage control that got Yorktown ready in 72 hours when everyone said it would take 3 months, pilots pressing attacks against odds that should have been impossible. Each piece was crucial. The American victory was also an industrial triumph. While we were fighting at Midway, new Essex-class carriers were under construction back home. Ships that made anything Japan could build look small. America built 24 Essex-class carriers. Japan struggled to complete 6 new carriers, most of them conversions or modifications, none of them equal to what America was producing. Japan started with 6 large carriers and the world's best naval aviators. After Midway, they had 2 operational carriers left, and their core of experienced pilots was gone. They built new carriers, but they never had trained pilots good enough to make them effective. The carefully crafted force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months simply ceased to exist that day. I survived the war flying 85 combat missions. I'm credited with hitting 3 ships at Midway: the Kaga, the Akagi, and the cruiser Kumano. I received the Navy Cross and retired as a captain in 1962 after Korean service. I lived to be 100 years old, passing away in 2016. By then, I was among the last of the Midway dive bomber pilots still alive. McCluskey recovered from his wounds. He retired as a rear admiral in 1956. He never really sought recognition for the decision that followed the destroyer and changed history. Quiet guy, didn't talk much about it. He died in 1976, and his pivotal role in the battle largely faded from public memory. George Gay became a TWA pilot after the war. He spent decades traveling around speaking about what happened to his squadron and the sacrifice those men made. He showed up at Navy events and reunions whenever he could. He died in 1994, and his ashes were scattered where his squadron went down, reuniting him with the men he'd seen die 52 years earlier. Dick Best, the pilot who sank the Akagi with 1 perfect bomb, had to medically retire after Midway. Caustic soda from a defective oxygen system permanently damaged his lungs. He never flew again after that day. But he lived until 2001, and people often called him the man who won Midway. The Japanese carriers rest on the Pacific floor in waters exceeding 17,000 feet. The Kaga was recently located in 2019, sitting upright on the bottom, hull intact, but the flight deck completely destroyed. The Akagi is nearby, showing massive fire damage. They're war graves, tombs of thousands. Admiral Nagumo survived the battle, but never really recovered. He was relegated to shore commands and eventually sent to defend Saipan. When the Americans overran the island in July 1944, he committed suicide. His chief of staff, Kusaka, survived and later wrote extensively about the battle, accepting responsibility while defending the impossible position Nagumo had faced. Captain Fuchida, who led the Pearl Harbor attack, was aboard the Akagi when she burned. Both his ankles were broken by the explosion, but he escaped. After the war, he became a Christian missionary, devoted to promoting reconciliation between Japan and America. He often said that at Midway, Japan lost the war in 5 minutes. Yamamoto, the admiral who planned it all, was killed in April 1943 when P-38 fighters, using decoded messages to find him, shot down his plane over Bougainville. After Midway, Japan couldn't win anymore. Yamamoto reportedly told his staff afterward, "I have killed many young men today." Midway was designated a national memorial in 2000. The runway where Marines faced impossible odds is now a wildlife sanctuary. Where bombs fell and men died, albatrosses nest peacefully. Norman's account reminds us that we weren't heroes. We were just young men doing necessary jobs. The real heroes were the torpedo crews who knew they were going to die but went anyway. The code breakers working in secret. The mechanics keeping planes in the air, the damage control teams saving ships, the corpsmen saving lives under impossible circumstances. Midway proved that wars aren't won by the best equipment or the most experienced warriors. They're won by those who adapt, see opportunities, sustain losses, and keep fighting. The Japanese had better pilots and better planes and more experience, but we had broken codes, radar, damage control they didn't have, and an industrial capacity that could replace losses 10 times over. Most importantly, we had leaders who understood that calculated risks were necessary. Nimitz risked the entire carrier force on intelligence that could have been wrong. McCluskey risked fuel exhaustion, finding the Japanese fleet. Best risked everything attacking a different carrier with just 2 wingmen. Waldron led his squadron to death, knowing the mission required it. The battle lasted 2 days, but changed everything. Before Midway, Japan was advancing everywhere, seemingly unstoppable. After, they never won another major offensive battle. The war continued for 3 more terrible years, costing hundreds of thousands more lives. But the outcome was decided in those June minutes when dive bombers caught Japan's carriers with armed aircraft on deck. Consider what might have happened if things had gone slightly different. If McCluskey had turned back at that empty intercept point. If the Japanese had launched 30 minutes earlier. If the torpedoes had worked and Torpedo 8 had actually sunk some carriers. Small decisions. Chance moments. Individual choices determining nations' fates. But history deals in what actually was. On that clear June morning in 1942, outnumbered American pilots in inferior aircraft caught the world's most powerful carrier force at maximum vulnerability and destroyed it. We turned a war through intelligence, courage, sacrifice, and luck. Today's generation can't imagine democracy itself being endangered, freedom's survival actually being questioned. We did. In June 1942, the free world's fate rested on a few hundred pilots from 3 carriers in the middle of the Pacific. We were enough. Against odds and logic, we were enough. That's Midway's lesson. Ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances can rise. Democracy produces warriors as brave as any totalitarian system. Free men fighting for their homes and families are Earth's most powerful force. The numbers were close. 357 Japanese died, 362 Americans. 4 Japanese carriers sunk, 1 American carrier. But those are just statistics. Each number was a human being, with hopes and dreams and fears, and people who loved them. Each death was a tragedy. Young men who should have seen grandchildren died in fire and water. The Pacific rolls on unchanged, unmarked by the battle. The coordinates where carriers sank are just ocean patches. But we remember. We must remember. As long as free people exist, we must remember Midway and its men. They saved the world in devastating minutes. 4 carriers, the Imperial Navy's pride, reduced to burning hulks in the time it took to have breakfast. A war's course, nations' fates, freedom's futures decided by dive bomber pilots, pressing attacks against impossible odds. That's the legacy, not just victory, but example. When tyranny threatens, free people rise. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's action despite it. Sometimes the world's fate rests on a few brave individuals, and ordinary people do extraordinary things. Midway's dead, American and Japanese alike, deserve to be remembered as humans who gave their lives serving their countries. American pilots flying to death protecting freedom. Japanese sailors dying saving burning ships. All brave men who deserved better than dying young in the middle of the Pacific. But their sacrifice wasn't vain. Freedom survived and flourished. The Pacific, once a battlefield, is now peaceful, traveled by merchant ships instead of warships. Japan and America, bitter enemies, are now close allies. The war that seemed like it would never end is now more than 70 years past. Soon no one will remain who can say, "I was there. I saw a carrier explode. I watched one burn. I dove through flak to hit my target." But the story endures, and it must endure, because a people who value freedom need to know that freedom isn't free. It's purchased with the blood of men climbing into obsolete torpedo planes, flying to their deaths, diving through walls of flak to hit their targets, giving everything to stop tyranny. That's what Midway did. It stopped tyranny. It saved freedom. It changed history. In world-altering minutes on a clear June morning in 1942, when the world's fate balanced and American pilots tipped the scales toward freedom,